The Nexus station floated in the darkness of space like a metal tumor, and it was exactly as ugly as Captain Marcus Cole remembered it to be when his freighter docked at Port 17 on a cold Tuesday morning that felt no different from any other miserable day in this corner of the galaxy. Marcus had been coming to this lawless place for 3 years now, ever since he left Earth behind and started his new life as a salvage trader among the stars. And every single time he visited, he promised himself it would be the last time. Yet here he was again, with a cargo hold full of scrap metal and broken machinery that he hoped would fetch enough credits to keep his ship running for another month or two. He walked through the crowded corridors of the station, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes scanning every shadow, because a human who let his guard down on Nexus Station was a human who woke up without his kidneys, or worse, did not wake up at all. Around him came in every shape and size imaginable, and most of them looked at Marcus with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to open disgust, because humans were still considered newcomers to the galactic community. Primitive apes who had somehow stumbled their way into space travel without blowing themselves up first, which many species considered to be nothing short of a miracle given humanity's violent history. Marcus did not care what they thought of him, because he had stopped caring about such things a long time ago, when he served 3 tours as a Marine in the outer colonies, and saw enough death and suffering to last him several lifetimes. And all he wanted now was to sell his salvage, buy some supplies, and get back to the quiet emptiness of deep space, where nobody bothered him. But the universe had other plans for Marcus Cole on this particular day, and those plans began when he took a wrong turn in the lower levels of the station and found himself standing at the entrance of a large underground chamber that smelled like fear and misery and something else that made his stomach turn. It was a slave auction, and Marcus had heard rumors about such places existing on Nexus Station, but had never seen one with his own eyes until this very moment, when he stood frozen in the doorway and watched as living beings were paraded across a stage like livestock while wealthy buyers shouted out their bids. He should have turned around and walked away, because this was none of his business, and getting involved in such matters was a good way to end up dead. But something kept his feet rooted to the floor as the auctioneer brought out the next item for sale. And when Marcus saw her, his heart stopped beating for just a moment. She was tall and thin, with silver skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the chamber, and her long white hair hung in dirty tangles around a face that might have been beautiful once before. Someone had beaten it into a mask of bruises and cuts, and her eyes were the color of pale amethysts as they stared out at the crowd with an expression of absolute emptiness that Marcus recognized all too well from his days in the war. The auctioneer announced her as Princess Cyril Vorthana of the Valanthi people, the last surviving member of the royal family of a world that had been conquered and destroyed by the Drath hegemony 5 years ago. And he described her like she was a rare antique rather than a living person, listing her qualities and her value while she stood there in chains and said nothing at all. Marcus learned that the Valanthi had been hunted to near extinction because their bodies produced bioluminescent glands that were prized by wealthy collectors across the galaxy. And this princess was one of the last of her kind, a trophy that any serious collector would be proud to own, though the auctioneer warned that she was damaged goods much longer given her current condition. The bidders in the crowd were exactly the kind of monsters that Marcus expected them to be, and he listened as they discussed what they would do with her in voices loud enough for everyone to hear. And some of their plans made him want to vomit, while others made him want to reach for the gun hidden under his jacket. The bidding started high, but quickly stalled because the princess was in such poor condition that many buyers doubted she would live long enough to be worth the investment. And the auctioneer grew frustrated as he tried to convince someone to make a serious offer for what he called the rarest specimen in the entire sector. Marcus did not know what came over him in that moment, but before he could stop himself, he raised his hand and shouted out a number that made the entire room go silent. A number that represented every single credit he had saved over 3 years of dangerous work, enough money to buy a small ship or a comfortable retirement on some quiet colony world. The auctioneer stared at him with an expression of pure disbelief and asked him to repeat himself, and Marcus did so in a voice that did not shake, even though his hands were trembling inside his pockets. The crowd began to laugh, because what would a primitive human want with a Volante princess? And surely this was some kind of joke, or perhaps the human was simply too stupid to understand what he was doing. But the auctioneer did not care about their laughter, because credits were credits and a sale was a sale. Nobody else made a higher bid, because nobody else wanted to waste good money on damaged merchandise, when there were healthier slaves available for purchase. And so the auctioneer declared the princess sold to the human in the back of the room, and told Marcus to come forward and collect his property. Marcus walked through the crowd, on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, eyes fixed on the princess as she watched him approach with those empty amethyst eyes that held no hope and no fear, because she had clearly passed beyond such emotions a long time ago. He took the chains from the handler and signed the transfer documents without reading them, and then he led the princess out of that terrible place, while the crowd continued to laugh at the foolish human who had just thrown away his entire fortune on a dying slave. They walked in silence through the corridors of Nexus Station, until they reached the docking bay where his ship waited, and Marcus helped her up the ramp and into the cargo hold, before sealing the door behind them and making sure that nobody had followed. The princess stood in the middle of his ship, with her head bowed and her shoulders hunched like she was waiting for the first blow to fall. And Marcus felt something break inside his chest as he looked at her, because he had seen that posture before, in the eyes of prisoners and refugees and all the broken people that war leaves behind. He knelt down in front of her, so that their eyes were level, and he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tool that he used for maintenance work. And with careful hands, he unlocked the restraints around her wrists and ankles, and let them fall to the floor with a heavy clang. She looked at him then with something other than emptiness in her eyes, something that might have been confusion, or fear, or perhaps a tiny spark of hope that she was afraid to let herself feel. Marcus stood up slowly and walked to the small kitchen area of his ship, and poured a glass of clean water, and he brought it back to her and held it out with both hands like an offering. And when she did not move to take it, he simply set it down on a crate beside her. "I am not your owner," he said in a quiet voice that carried no threat and no demand. "I am just the guy getting you out of here, and wherever you want to go after. This is entirely up to you." She stared at him like he was speaking a language she could not understand. And maybe he was, because kindness was a foreign concept in the world she had been living in for the past 5 years. But Marcus just smiled at her, a small and tired smile that did not reach his eyes. And then he turned and walked to the cockpit to begin the launch sequence, because the sooner they got away from this station, the better. Behind him, Princess Ciriel Vorthana stood alone in the cargo hold of a stranger's ship, and tried to remember what hope felt like. 3 days passed aboard the freighter called the Second Chance. And during those 3 days, Princess Ciriel spoke not a single word to the human who had bought her freedom with everything he owned. She waited for the trick to reveal itself, because there was always a trick when someone showed you kindness in this cruel galaxy. And she had learned that lesson many times over during her years of captivity, when guards would offer her food only to snatch it away at the last moment, while laughing at her desperation. But the human named Marcus did not play any tricks on her, and instead he did things that made no sense to her broken mind. He gave her the only private cabin on the ship, and moved his own belongings into a small storage closet near the engine room, where he slept on a thin mattress that looked terribly uncomfortable. And when she tried to refuse this arrangement, he simply shrugged his shoulders and said that guests always got the best room on his. He cooked meals for her using strange earth ingredients that she had never tasted before. Things called pasta and rice and vegetables that came from a world on the other side of the galaxy. And he left the food outside her door without demanding that she eat with him or even acknowledge his presence. He never touched her, and never raised his voice, and never looked at her with hunger or cruelty in his eyes. And this confused Sci-Fi more than anything else, because she had forgotten that such men could exist, in a universe that had shown her nothing but darkness for so long. On the fourth day, she finally spoke, and her voice came out as a harsh whisper, because she had not used it for many months before this moment. "Why?" she asked, as she stood in the doorway of the cockpit, where Marcus sat watching the stars drift by through the viewport. He turned to look at her with tired eyes that held sadness, but also something warm that she could not identify. He did not pretend to misunderstand her question. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because I have seen what happens when good people do nothing while evil happens right in front of them." She shook her head, because this answer was not enough, and she needed to understand what kind of creature this human was before she could decide whether to trust him or to fear him. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. "What payment do you expect for this supposed kindness you have shown?" Marcus let out a long breath and gestured for her to sit in the co-pilot chair beside him. And after a long moment of hesitation, she moved forward and lowered herself into the seat, while keeping as much distance between them as the small cockpit would allow. "I want nothing from you," he said. "Absolutely nothing, except maybe a chance to tell you a story about where I come from and why I did what I did back on that station." She nodded slowly, because stories were harmless enough. And so Marcus began to speak about a small blue planet called Earth that floated in a quiet corner of the Milky Way galaxy. He told her about human history, which was filled with more violence and cruelty than she would have expected from a species that seemed so fragile and short-lived. And he spoke of wars and conquests and empires that had risen and fallen long before humans ever dreamed of reaching the stars. He told her about slavery on Earth, how humans had once bought and sold each other like property, how entire peoples had been captured and chained and forced to work until they died, and how this terrible practice had existed for thousands of years across every human civilization. But then he told her about the people who had fought against this evil, ordinary men and women who had risked everything to help slaves escape to freedom, who had written books and given speeches and started wars to end the suffering of their people. Fellow humans. SP. He told her about a man called Abraham Lincoln who had led his nation through a bloody civil war to free millions of enslaved people, and about a woman called Harriet Tubman who had personally guided hundreds of escaped slaves to safety through enemy territory. "Where I come from," Marcus said with something like pride in his voice, "we have a saying that goes like this: the measure of a person is not what they take from the world, but what they give back to it." Sci-Fi listened to all of this with growing wonder, because she had never heard of a species that had fought so hard against its own worst instincts. And she began to see the human sitting beside her in a new light. "Your people learned," she whispered. "You were monsters, and then you chose to be something else." Marcus nodded, but there was sadness in his eyes as he spoke again. "We are still learning," he admitted, "and we have not yet finished becoming the people we want to be. But every generation tries to be a little bit better than the one that came before, and maybe that is the most anyone can hope for." Something shifted inside Cyril's heart, as she sat there in the darkness of space with this strange and gentle human. And for the first time in 5 years, she felt the frozen walls around her soul begin to crack just a little. She started talking then, slowly at first and then faster, as the words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, telling Marcus about her world and her people, and the terrible day when the Drath hegemony came to destroy everything she had ever loved. She told him about the beauty of Volanthos Prime, with its crystal forests and singing rivers, and cities that glowed with bioluminescent light, and about her family, who had ruled that world with kindness and wisdom for 1,000 generations. She told him about the invasion, how the Drath warships had filled the sky like a swarm of metal locusts. The screams of her people had echoed through the burning streets as soldiers hunted them down for their precious glands. She told him about watching her mother and father and siblings die one by one, executed in front of her, as a warning to any who might resist, and about being dragged away in chains while her world burned behind her. Tears streamed down her silver face as she spoke, the first tears she had allowed herself to shed since her capture, and Marcus sat quietly beside her and let her cry, without trying to offer empty comfort or hollow words. When she finally finished her story, the silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable, and Cyril realized that she felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her pain had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. "I am the last of my kind," she said, "the last of the royal bloodline, and soon I will die, and there will be nothing left of the Volanthi except memories and bones," firmly, and turned to face her with fire in his eyes. "You are not going to die," he said, "not if I have anything to say about it. And as for being the last of your kind, well, we will just have to see about that." Before she could ask what he meant by those words, an alarm began blaring throughout the ship, and red lights flashed across the cockpit controls. Marcus swore in a language she did not understand, and threw himself into his pilot's seat, his fingers dancing across the controls as he pulled up sensor data on the main screen. "We have company," he growled. "A Drath warship just dropped out of hyperspace, and they are heading straight for us." Cyril felt the familiar cold grip of terror seize her heart, because she knew exactly why the Drath had come. And she opened her mouth to tell Marcus to surrender her and save himself. But before she could speak, the communication system crackled to life, and a harsh alien voice filled the cockpit with words that made her blood run cold. "Human vessel, this is Commander Vrock of the Drath hegemony," the voice announced. "You are harboring stolen property belonging to the hegemony, and you will surrender the Volanthi female immediately or face destruction." Marcus looked at Cyril for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen in any of her captors, something that burned with a fierce and terrible light. "Hold on to something," he said with a grim smile, and then he opened the communication channel and spoke 3 words that changed everything. "Come and take her." The Drath warship was 10 times the size of the Second Chance, and carried enough firepower to reduce a small moon to rubble. And Commander Vrock sat in his command chair with a smile on his reptilian face as he watched the tiny human freighter on his view screen. This would be an easy hunt, he thought to himself, because humans were weak and primitive creatures who posed no threat to a warrior of the hegemony, and soon he would return the escaped princess to her proper place in chains. But Commander Vrock had made a terrible mistake, the same mistake that countless enemies had made throughout human history, and that mistake was underestimating what a single determined human could do when everything he cared about was on the line. Marcus pushed the Second Chance into a steep dive toward the swirling chaos of the Shroud Nebula, a region of space filled with radiation storms and electromagnetic interference that made sensors nearly useless and weapons targeting almost impossible. The Drath warship followed without hesitation because Commander Vrak was too proud to let a primitive human escape him. And as both ships plunged into the glowing clouds of the nebula, the real battle began. Cyril gripped her seat with white-knuckled hands as Marcus flew his ship through the nebula like a man possessed, weaving between radiation pockets and magnetic anomalies with a skill that seemed impossible for any pilot to possess. "How are you doing this?" she shouted over the roar of the straining engines. Marcus did not take his eyes off the controls as he answered, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Humans are not the fastest species in the galaxy," he said, "and we are not the strongest or the smartest or the most technologically advanced, but we have one gift that makes us dangerous beyond measure." He yanked the ship into a barrel roll to avoid a burst of plasma fire that burned past them close enough to scorch the hull. "We adapt," he continued. "We learn from every defeat and every victory. We steal the best ideas from everyone we meet, and we never ever stop fighting until the war is won." The Drath warship was having trouble tracking them through the interference of the nebula, and Marcus used this advantage to lead his pursuer deeper into the most dangerous region of the cosmic storm. He had spent months studying the Shroud Nebula during his salvage operations, learning its currents and patterns the way a sailor learns the tides of an ocean, and now that knowledge was going to save their lives. "There is a pocket of stable space about 2 minutes ahead," he told Cyril, "and when we reach it, I need you to do exactly what I tell you." She nodded, because she had no other choice but to trust this human who was risking everything to protect her. And 2 minutes later, they burst out of the radiation storm into a small calm area surrounded on all sides by deadly energy fields. Marcus immediately cut the engines and began working on something at the engineering console, and Cyril watched in confusion as he started pulling components out of the ship's systems. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "The Drath will follow us here," Marcus explained as he worked, "and when they do, they will send boarding parties, because Commander Vrak wants you alive, and he knows he cannot risk destroying us with ship weapons." He finished his work and held up a collection of parts that Cyril did not recognize. "I am going to make sure his boarding parties regret that decision." The next 20 minutes were a blur of activity as Marcus transformed his peaceful cargo ship into a death trap, rigging explosives in the corridors and setting up ambush positions with weapons he had hidden throughout the vessel. Cyril helped where she could, following his instructions to move crates and seal doors. Efficiency with which this gentle man prepared to kill. "You have done this before," she observed. Marcus paused for just a moment, and a shadow passed across his face. 3 tours in the outer colonies," he said quietly, "fighting rebels and pirates and worse things that I do not like to remember. And I swore I would never kill again after I left the Marines. But some things are worth breaking a promise for." The Drath warship emerged from the nebula storm 15 minutes later, and just as Marcus had predicted, it launched a dozen boarding pods toward the second chance, while keeping its main weapons powered down. "Stay in the engine room and seal the door behind you," Marcus told Cyril as he checked his weapons one final time. "And no matter what you hear, do not come out until I tell you it is safe." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told her that this was not a request, and so she retreated to the engine room and sealed herself inside, while the sounds of the boarding pods attaching to the hull echoed through the ship. What followed was something that Cyril would never forget for as long as she lived. She heard the Drath soldiers breach the airlocks and storm into the corridors of the second chance, their heavy boots thundering against the metal floors as they spread out to search for their prey. Then she heard the explosions. Marcus had placed his traps perfectly, and the first wave of Drath soldiers died before they even knew they were in danger, torn apart by improvised explosives that turned the corridors into killing zones. The survivors regrouped and pushed forward more carefully, but they were trained to fight other Drath, or the weak species that populated this region of space. Not a human marine who had spent years learning to kill in the most brutal conflicts humanity had ever known. Through the sealed door, Cyril heard the sounds of gunfire and screaming. Terrible, wet thuds of hand-to-hand combat, and she pressed her hands over her ears, but could not block out the noise of men dying. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and then suddenly, everything went quiet, and Cyril was left in the darkness of the engine room, with nothing but the sound of her own racing heartbeat. A knock came at the door. 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones, the signal that Marcus had taught her before the battle began. She opened the door and found him standing in the corridor, surrounded by the bodies of Drath soldiers, and he was covered in blood, both red and black, and he was swaying on his feet like a man about to collapse. "All clear," he said with a weak smile, and then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he fell forward into her arms. Cyril caught him before he hit the floor, and she saw the terrible wounds that covered his body, deep cuts from Drath claws, and burns from energy weapons, and a piece of metal shrapnel sticking out of his shoulder. Any other species would have died from such injuries, but Marcus was still breathing, still fighting to stay alive, with the same stubborn determination that had carried him through the battle. She dragged him to the medical bay, her own weakened body screaming in protest as she hauled his weight through corridors slick with blood, and she strapped him to the treatment table and began searching for the medical supplies she would need. Cyril had never been trained as a healer, but she had watched the doctors in her father's court work their craft many times, and she used that knowledge now to remove the shrapnel and seal the wounds and pump antibiotics into his system. For 3 days she watched over him as fever raged through his body, changing his bandages and forcing water between his cracked lips, and talking to him, even though she did not know if he could hear her. World, about the festivals, and the music, and the way the crystal forests sang when the wind blew through them. And she made him promises that she would not let him die. On the 4th day his fever broke, and his eyes opened, and the first thing he saw was Cyril sitting beside him, with dark circles under her eyes, and relief written across her silver face. "You saved my life," he whispered. She took his hand in hers and squeezed gently. "You saved mine first," she said, "and now we are even. So when you are healed, I want you to teach me how to fight like you did, because I am tired of being helpless, and I am tired of being afraid." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time since she had met him. "Deal," he said, and something new began to grow between them in that moment. 6 months had passed since the battle in the Shroud Nebula, and in that time, everything had changed for both Marcus and Cyril. The Second Chance no longer wandered aimlessly through space looking for salvage, because it now had a mission, a purpose that gave meaning to every jump through hyperspace and every stop at forgotten stations on the edge of civilized territory. Marcus had shared his plan with Cyril during his recovery, a plan that had seemed impossible at first, but grew more real with every passing week. The Volanthi had not been completely destroyed by the Drath hegemony, despite what the official records claimed, and scattered across the galaxy in hidden colonies and refugee camps were survivors who had escaped the genocide and lived in secret, always afraid that their hunters would find them. Marcus was going to find them first. He used every contact from his smuggling days, called in every favor he was owed, and spread the word through the underground networks that connected the lawless spaces between empires. The response was slow at first, just whispers and rumors and possible sightings that led nowhere. But eventually, the whispers became voices, and the voices led them to their first destination. On a frozen moon orbiting a dying star, they found a colony of 37 Volanthi living in underground caves, hiding from the universe, and waiting for the day when the draft would finally find them. When Sci-Realm stepped off the second chance, and the colonists saw her bioluminescent markings glowing in the darkness of their cave, they fell to their knees and wept, because they recognized the royal patterns that had been burned into their memories since childhood. Their princess had returned from the dead, and with her came something they had lost long ago: hope. This scene repeated itself a dozen times over the following months, as Marcus and Sci-Realm traveled from one hidden refuge to another, finding pockets of HFY survivors scattered across the galaxy like seeds waiting to bloom. Each time Sci-Realm spoke to her people, she grew stronger, and Marcus watched with pride as the broken slave he had rescued transformed into something magnificent before his eyes. She stopped looking at the ground when she walked, and started looking at the stars. Her bioluminescent markings, which had been dim and flickering when he first saw her, now blazed with brilliant light that filled every room she entered. Her voice, once a hoarse whisper, became clear and powerful as she addressed crowds of her people and spoke of rebuilding and resistance and a future worth fighting for. But Sci-Realm did not just rely on inspiration and hope, because she also learned the practical skills she would need to make her vision a reality. Every day she trained with Marcus, learning the combat techniques he had mastered during his years as a Marine. Quick and dedicated student who pushed herself harder than he ever pushed her. She studied human history from the data files on the second chance, reading about revolutions and resistance movements, and the tactics that ordinary people had used to overthrow tyrants throughout the ages. She learned about organization and logistics and supply chains, about how to build a movement from nothing and keep it hidden from enemies who had eyes everywhere. And she learned something else from Marcus, something that he did not teach her with words, but demonstrated through his actions every single day. She learned that strength and gentleness could exist in the same person, that a warrior could also be a healer, and that true power came not from fear, but from love. The Drath hegemony eventually noticed that something was happening in the dark corners of the galaxy where the Volanthi survivors hid. Reports reached the High Command that the princess was still alive, that she was gathering her people and speaking of resistance, and that she was being helped by a human who had killed an entire boarding party with his bare hands. They sent their most deadly asset to deal with this problem, a silicate assassin named Crystallis, who had never failed to eliminate a target in 300 years of service. Silicates were creatures of living crystal, nearly indestructible beings who could reshape their bodies into weapons and move through solid matter like ghosts, and they were feared throughout the galaxy as the ultimate hunters. Crystallis caught up with Marcus and Sci-Realm at a trading station where they had gone to negotiate for supplies, and the attack came without warning in the middle of a crowded marketplace. One moment Marcus was haggling with a merchant over the price of medical equipment, and the next moment a blade of living crystal was punching through his chest armor and spilling his blood across the station floor. He fell backward and saw Crystallis standing over him, a humanoid figure made entirely of shifting purple crystal, with no face and no mercy in its alien form. But before the silicate could deliver the killing blow, Sci-Realm was there. She had been training for 6 months with a man who had survived wars that would have broken most species, and all of that training came together in a single moment of perfect violence. She struck the silicate with a weapon that Marcus had given her, a plasma cutter modified to burn at temperatures hot enough to melt crystal, and Crystallis screamed in a voice like shattering glass as part of its body dissolved. The assassin tried to reform and counterattack, but Sci-Realm was already moving, using the combat techniques that Marcus had drilled into her until they became instinct. She was not as strong as the silicate, and she was not as fast, but she was fighting for something that the assassin could not understand. And that made all the difference. The battle lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. And when it was over, Crystallis was retreating through the walls of the station, badly damaged and fleeing for the first time in its centuries-long existence. Sci-Rail did not chase it because Marcus was bleeding on the floor, and he needed her more than she needed revenge. She got him back to the ship and into the medical bay, and as she worked to save his life for the second time, she made a decision that would change the fate of the galaxy. When Marcus woke up 2 days later, with fresh bandages on his chest, and Sci-Rail sitting beside him, she was already composing a message on the ship's communication system. "What are you doing?" he asked in a weak voice. She turned to face him, and he saw something new in her amethyst eyes. Something fierce and determined that had not been there before. "I am tired of hiding," she said. "I am tired of running, and I am tired of watching the people I care about bleed for me while I do nothing but survive." She pressed a button, and the message began broadcasting across every Volanthi frequency in the galaxy, reaching hidden colonies and refugee camps and scared survivors who had spent years living in fear. "I am Sci-Rael Vorthana," her recorded voice announced, "daughter of King Aldros and Queen Luminara, last of the royal bloodline of Volanthos Prime, and I am alive." Marcus listened as her message continued, calling on all Volanthi survivors to gather at a secret location, promising them that the time for hiding was over and the time for fighting had begun. "The Drath hegemony stole our world and murdered our families," Sci-Rael's voice declared. "But they did not destroy our spirit, and they did not extinguish our light, and now we will show them that the Volanthi are not so easy to kill." When the message ended, Marcus looked at Sci-Rael with a mixture of concern and awe, pride. "You know what this means," he said. "The Drath will come for you with everything they have, and there will be no more running." Sci-Rael smiled, and her bioluminescent markings blazed so bright that they lit up the entire medical bay. "Then we had better start building an army," she said, "because I am going home, Marcus, and I am taking my world back." The fleet that gathered above the dead world of Volanthos Prime was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. A ragged armada of freighters and transports and salvage ships carrying the last survivors of a murdered people, and the allies who had chosen to stand with them. At the center of the formation flew the Second Chance, no longer a humble salvage vessel, but the flagship of a revolution, and on its bridge stood Princess Sci-Rael Vorthana, with Marcus Cole at her side. The story of the human who had bought a princess and set her free had spread across the galaxy in the months since her broadcast, passed from station to station and ship to ship, until it reached the ears of people who had lost faith in kindness. Humans had come from Earth and the colony worlds, volunteers who wanted to be part of something bigger than themselves, soldiers and pilots and ordinary people who believed that some things were worth fighting for. Other species had joined as well, refugees and former slaves, and anyone who had suffered under the cruelty of empires like the Drath hegemony, all of them drawn by the impossible hope that one woman and one human represented. But hope alone would not win this battle. Below them, Volanthos Prime had been transformed into a fortress, the once beautiful world now covered in Drath military installations and mining operations that stripped the planet of its resources. The Drath fleet defending the planet outnumbered the rebel armada 3-1, and their ships were larger and better armed, and crewed by warriors who had never known defeat. Commander Vrak himself had been given command of the defense, and he had sworn a blood oath to finally destroy the princess who had humiliated him in the Shroud Nebula. The battle began at dawn, according to the old Volanthi calendar, and it was every bit as brutal as Marcus had feared it would be. Ships exploded in silent flowers of fire and debris, and thousands died in the first minutes of combat as the two fleets tore into each other with everything they had. Marcus watched from the bridge of the Second Chance as the battle raged around them, coordinating the Allied forces with the tactical skills he had learned in the Marines, while Sarail broadcast encouragement to her people in their native language. For 3 hours, the fighting continued without either side gaining a clear advantage, and Marcus began to fear that they had come so far only to fail at the final moment. Then something unexpected happened. Deep within the Drath fleet, 3 warships suddenly broke formation and began firing on their own allies, their crews revealing themselves as slaves and prisoners who had been secretly recruited to the rebel cause. The Drath formation fell into chaos as commanders tried to figure out which ships could be trusted, and Marcus saw the opening they needed. "All ships, this is Cole," he broadcast across the fleet frequency. "Push through the gap now. Everything we have, full speed toward the planet." The rebel armada surged forward like a spear thrust at the heart of the enemy, punching through the confused Drath lines and racing toward the atmosphere of Valanthos Prime. Landing craft launched from every ship as soon as they were in range, carrying soldiers and fighters down to the surface to begin the ground assault. Marcus and Sarail rode one of those craft down through fire and smoke, and when it crashed through the roof of a Drath barracks, they were the first ones out the door with weapons blazing. The fighting on the surface was even more desperate than the battle in space. Drath soldiers poured out of every building and fortification, determined to defend their conquest against the ragged army of rebels who had dared to challenge them. But the rebels fought with something the Drath could not match, a fire in their hearts, burned brighter than fear or pain or the certainty of death. Valanthi warriors reclaimed their homeworld, one building at a time, their bioluminescent markings glowing with the fury of a people who had been pushed to the edge of extinction and refused to fall. Human soldiers fought beside them with the relentless endurance that had carried their species through every challenge in their history, refusing to retreat even when the odds seemed impossible. And at the center of it all was Sarail, leading her people through the streets of what had once been her capital city, fighting her way toward the palace where her family had been murdered 5 years ago. Marcus stayed at her side through every step of that terrible journey, watching her back and clearing the path ahead, and together they cut through the Drath forces like a blade through silk. They reached the throne room as the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood that seemed fitting for the day. Overlord Draxus was waiting for them, the warlord who had personally ordered the genocide of the Valanthi people, and watched as Sarail's family was executed before her eyes. He was massive even by Drath standards, a mountain of scales and muscle covered in ceremonial armor that had been forged from the melted jewelry of Valanthi royalty. "So the slave returns," Draxus laughed as Sarail entered the throne room, broken and beaten and leading an army of primitives and refugees against the might of the hegemony. He gestured at Marcus with contempt. "And this is the human who bought you, yes? What a pathetic creature, short-lived and weak, barely more than an animal, pretending to be civilized." Sarail stepped forward, and her bioluminescent markings blazed with light so bright that it made the overlords squint. "You taught me something," she said in a voice that carried no fear. "Or rather, he taught me something that you could never understand." She glanced at Marcus, who stood bloody but unbowed at the entrance of the throne room. "Humans have a concept they call paying it forward," Sarail continued. "It means that when someone helps you, you repay that debt by helping others in turn, creating a chain of kindness that stretches forward forever." She raised her weapon. "A human gave me my life back when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose," she declared. "And now I take back my world so that I can give my people their lives back too." The final fight was short and brutal. Overlord Draxus was a skilled warrior, but he was fighting for conquest and glory, while Sarail was fighting for everything that mattered. And when she drove her blade through his heart, she felt the weight of 5 years of suffering finally lift from her shoulders. The Drath forces surrendered within hours of their overlord's death, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, Valanthos Prime was free. 2 months later, Sci-Rail stood in the rebuilt throne room of her ancestors. But she did not wear a crown, because she had decided that the old ways of her people needed to change. Instead of being crowned as a princess ruling by birth, she was elected as queen by the voice of her people, in a ceremony that blended Valanthi tradition with human democratic ideals. At her coronation, she announced a formal alliance between the restored Valanthi sovereignty and the United Earth Coalition, promising that their two peoples would stand together as equals in a galaxy that desperately needed hope. That Valanthos Prime would forever be a sanctuary for any species fleeing persecution, a beacon of light in the darkness of space, where the broken could be healed and the enslaved could find freedom. Marcus watched the ceremony from the back of the crowd, trying to slip away unnoticed, because he had never been comfortable with praise or attention. But Sci-Rail found him before he could escape, pushing through the crowd until she stood in front of him with joy shining in her amethyst eyes. "Where do you think you are going?" she asked with a smile. "I figured my job was done," Marcus said with a shrug. "You do not need me anymore." Sci-Rail took his hand in hers and held it tight. "You gave me a new life," she said loud enough for the entire assembly to hear. "Now help me give them one too." And across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000 ships, people watched and wondered what else these remarkable humans were capable of. Answer. They would discover in the years to come was more than anyone had ever imagined.